Imagine you are holding a survival manual in your hands, but it is absolutely not a normal one.
Right, definitely not your standard outdoor guide.
No, not at all. This particular manual was dictated directly to the devil, sitting right in hell's sub-basement.
Yeah.
And it was dictated by this relentlessly cheerful human being who somehow managed to completely annoy the Prince of Darkness with sheer, unadulterated toxic positivity.
It's hilarious.
It is basically a reverse Faustian bargain. Like, the devil doesn't even want his soul, you know? He just wants him to stop being so optimistic. It is just an absolutely brilliant premise.
It really is. I mean, it is genuinely one of the most bizarre and honestly captivating sets of source material we have ever pulled apart for a deep dive.
Oh, totally.
Just to give you a sense of the tone, the devil actually notes in the prologue that in 13 billion years of cosmic existence, he has blinked exactly 17 times.
Wow.
Yeah, and meeting this man was one of those times.
That is just incredible. So the man in question here is Theodore Brightness. He lived from 1827 all the way to 1924.
Reaching the ripe old age of 97.
Exactly. And the reason he lived that long is the entire focal point of our deep dive today. Because during his nearly century on Earth, Theodore survived, well, he survived the American Civil War.
The Great Chicago Fire, too.
Right. The Chicago Fire, the Siege of Paris, multiple plagues, deadly duels, and several actual shipwrecks.
The man just absolutely refused to die.
He really did. And his self-appointed mission in the afterlife was to sit down in hell and dictate his psychological toolkit for surviving everything, from massive historical catastrophes right down to the grinding, mundane annoyances of everyday life.
So our goal today is to extract Theodore's completely unorthodox, slightly delusional, but, highly effective toolkit from these sources.
Right.
Because what becomes clear very quickly is that Theodore didn't survive by being physically stronger.
Right.
Or tactically smarter than anyone else.
Yeah, it wasn't like a super soldier.
Exactly. He survived because of how he manipulated his own perception of reality.
I promise you, by the time we finish this deep dive, you are going to have a completely new and strangely comforting way to look at your absolute worst days.
And even just your minor daily frustrations.
Yes, and your deepest anxieties. But to understand how one man physically survives a century of unyielding historical disasters, we don't start with physical survival tactics.
Right, no fire building or knot tying here.
Nope. We have to explore a single, honestly infuriatingly simple catchphrase that kept his heart beating. And this whole philosophy starts with a small town in Vermont literally sliding into a lake.
Yeah, we need to go back to the year 1838 for this one. Theodore was just 11 years old at the time.
Just a kid.
Just a kid. And his hometown in Vermont experiences this severe geological event. It's basically a localized earthquake combined with a massive mudslide.
Just a nightmare.
Complete nightmare. It causes the entire settlement to slowly but inexorably slide toward the waters of Lake Champlain. It is this bizarre, slow-motion catastrophe.
And while all the neighbors are screaming, right, they're grabbing their valuables, they're absolutely panicking.
Understandably.
Very understandably. But Theodore's father, who happens to be a clockmaker and a bit of an amateur philosopher, he just calmly walks through their house.
So calm.
Yeah, he packs up his most valuable timepieces and several wheels of cheese. Tenderly. He then gathers his family and tells them with absolute unwavering confidence that the sliding is going to stop soon. He predicts it will probably be over within the hour.
Which was incredibly incorrect.
So incorrect.
It actually took 3 agonizing days for the earth to finally settle. By the time it was over, their home was entirely destroyed.
Just completely submerged in mud and water.
Exactly.
Okay, let's unpack this for a second. Because isn't this just lying to yourself?
Wow.
I mean, it sounds like a catastrophic failure of judgment. If I am on a commercial flight and the pilot just blatantly ignores a blinking red engine failure light because they firmly, believe the plane is fine and the worst is over.
We're going down.
Right. We are going to crash into a mountain. How is the father's reaction here not just passive, dangerous denial?
What's fascinating here is the distinction between passive denial and what psychologists today might actually call functional delusion.
Functional delusion?
Yeah. Theodore's father wasn't ignoring the catastrophe, right? I mean, he packed the survival essentials, the wealth and the food.
The watches and the cheese.
Exactly. But mentally, he was generating the psychological energy required to endure an agonizing 3-day ordeal.
Oh, I see.
When you face an overwhelming, prolonged trauma, your emotional grid can just completely overload. Functional delusion acts like a circuit breaker.
It trips the breaker.
Yes, it trips the breaker, shutting down the blind panic so the core operating system, which is your basic survival instincts, can actually keep functioning.
That makes a lot of sense. So, standing on a hill 3 days later, looking at the absolute ruins of his life, the father turns to young Theodore and just says, "You see, I was right. It's over now."
Yeah, accuracy just didn't matter. Surviving mattered.
And he passed down this core philosophy to Theodore, this idea that accuracy is far less important than attitude. So the central mantra for the rest of Theodore's entire life became, "The worst is nearly over."
And that phrase becomes the literal psychological engine for Theodore's entire century on Earth.
It really does.
And to see the mechanics of how this functional delusion operates under extreme duress, we have to examine his time in the American Civil War.
Specifically, the harrowing aftermath of the Battle of Gettysburg in 1863.
Right. The sources paint an incredibly grim picture of the medical tents there. Theodore finds himself acting as an impromptu surgical assistant in a makeshift hospital.
Which is horrifying. He is literally holding down a 19-year-old Union soldier who is about to have his leg amputated.
Without modern anesthesia, Rebecca.
Without modern anesthesia. The boy is terrified, and he looks up at Theodore and asks, point blank, if he is going to die.
And Theodore doesn't actually know.
He has no clue. He has no medical training. He could be honest and say he has absolutely no idea if the boy will bleed out in 5 minutes.
But he doesn't.
No. Instead, he looks the soldier right in the eye and says, "The hard part's almost over."
And as the surgeon begins using the saw, Theodore doesn't offer these grand, sweeping promises about the boy going home to get married and live a long life.
Right. He shrinks the timeline.
Exactly. He breaks the horror down into tiny micro increments. He tells him, "Nearly done now, almost through this inch. The worst is passing."
Just inch by inch.
He calls this psychological technique granular optimism.
Which is such a brilliant way to manipulate human perception. I mean, by measuring a catastrophe in small enough units, just this hour, this minute, this specific breath, the worst is always nearly over because you're constantly moving through time.
Neurologically speaking, shrinking the timeline actually reduces the cognitive load of trauma on the brain.
Oh, really?
Yeah. The human mind cannot compute the entire future of a traumatic event all at once without spiraling into shock.
That makes total sense.
Theodore didn't know if that boy would survive the systemic infection that usually followed amputations back then.
Or what his life would even be like as a disabled veteran in the 1860s.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But by managing the immediate granular reality, he provided a far better psychological environment for the boy's body to endure the shock than despair ever would have.
And the boy actually makes it. 2 weeks later, he tells Theodore, "You were right, the hard part was almost over."
Yeah.
Now, Theodore admits in his manual dictated to the devil that he was only talking about the physical amputation itself, not the rest of the boy's incredibly difficult life.
Of course.
But measuring survival breath by breath is highly effective for a 30-minute surgery. The question the sources pivot to next, though, is what happens when a catastrophe doesn't last 30 minutes but drags on for agonizing months?
Right, because when a crisis becomes chronic, the strategy has to evolve. You can't rely on granular optimism when the timeline stretches indefinitely.
You'll just burn out.
You'd absolutely burn out. You have to move to a much heavier psychological tool, which Theodore categorized as the radical reinterpretation of worsening circumstances.
It's quite a mouthful. But Theodore gets the perfect, albeit tragic, opportunity to test this out during the Franco-Prussian War in 1870.
He really does.
And it stems from a hilariously terrible personal decision. He travels to Paris to help his wife's brother move to America, and he arrives in the city exactly 5 days before the war begins.
Terrible timing.
Awful. He looked at the geopolitical tension and mistook the calm before the storm for the calm after the storm.
Yeah. Consequently, he traps his entire extended family in a brutal war zone. Paris gets locked in a 4-month siege.
4 months.
They're surrounded by the Prussian army. The city is subjected to artillery shelling. The winter is completely freezing, and the civilian population is literally starving to death.
Yet Theodore insists, week after miserable week, that the siege is almost over. I mean, by week 8, the food supply is so decimated that people in Paris are resorting to eating rats from the sewers.
It was incredibly grim.
But Theodore refuses to see this as a sign of the apocalypse. He reframes it for his family. He tells them, look, people are eating rats, which historically is a sign that the siege is entering its absolute final stages because it cannot possibly get worse.
He is radically reinterpreting the decline. When your environment deteriorates, You don't deny that it's worse. You simply reframe worse as closer to the finish line.
Wow.
By week 12, the city has exhausted the sewer rats, and people are butchering and eating the exotic animals from the Parasu.
The elephants, the camel.
Yes, elephants, camels, wolves. And Theodore's response remains unshakable. He says this is clearly unsustainable, therefore the end is imminent.
It is the exact same psychology used by those aggressive financial pundits on television who predict a massive civilization-ending stock market crash every single calendar year.
Oh, that's a great comparison.
Right. They are wrong year after year, but eventually a recession hits, the market crashes, and they get to go on tour claiming they were financial visionaries all along.
Exactly. And Theodore actually coined a term for this in the manual. Retroactive vindication.
Retroactive vindication.
Yeah. If you confidently predict that a siege is going to end tomorrow for 129 consecutive days, nobody keeps track of the 128 days you looked like an idiot.
They really don't.
No. They only remember the final day when the gates finally open and you are proven right.
It sounds absurd, but it actually provides a vital sociological framework for enduring a long-term disaster. During those 4 months in Paris, Theodore identified something crucial. He called it the catastrophe within the catastrophe.
Right.
The Prussian artillery destroying buildings was the primary catastrophe, but the secondary, often more dangerous threat was the other people trapped inside the city with him.
Think about how this applies to modern life, too. When your company announces massive layoffs and the corporate rumor mill spins out of control, you see these exact same survival archetypes emerge.
Oh, his categorization of the people around him is so universally applicable. It's like a personality test for a crisis.
It really is. He observed 3 distinct types of responses to prolonged trauma. First, you have the panickers.
Obviously.
Yeah, these people constantly vocalize their despair, which actively drains the psychological energy of everyone around them. Second, you have the deniers.
They're the dangerous ones.
Very dangerous. These people pretend the artillery shells aren't falling, they take unnecessary risks, and they ultimately get themselves or others killed. Finally, you have the productive optimists.
And the prime example in his manual being Madame Charpentier, right? The housekeeper of the boarding house they were trapped in.
Precisely. While the entire city is starving and dining on zoo animals, Madame Charpentier wakes up every single morning and meticulously sweeps the floors of the boarding house.
Just sweeping the floor.
She maintained a very simple philosophy. The siege would end whenever the armies decided it would end, so in the meantime, they might as well inhabit a clean building.
That's amazing.
Sweeping the floors didn't conjure up any food, but the routine, the localized control, prevented her mind from succumbing to despair.
Right. Are you just sweeping the floor to stay sane? Because it is so clear how this functional delusion protects your brain during a war or a corporate collapse.
Absolutely, yeah.
You essentially trick your own nervous system into pushing through the horror. But the manual takes a really unexpected turn here. Theodore's philosophy actually faces its greatest existential threat, not in the middle of a burning city, but during a period of absolute uninterrupted peace.
Yeah, we jump the timeline forward to the year 1895. Theodore is now 68 years old. He is living in Maryland.
Nice and quiet.
Very quiet. His clockmaking shop is thriving. His wife, Constance, is in perfect health. His children have grown up successfully. There are no wars, no fires, no plagues, and Theodore is absolutely terrified.
He catches himself constantly catastrophizing the absence of catastrophe. He starts hoarding money under the floorboards, obsessively reading multiple newspapers looking for threats, just waiting for the other shoe to drop. Because he had built his entire identity and his entire psychological framework around the act of surviving, he felt completely adrift when there was nothing actively trying to kill him.
He had fallen into the psychological trap of surviving success.
Surviving success.
Right. When a human nervous system is trained by the horrors of the American Civil War and the Siege of Paris, it becomes hypervigilant. It forgets how to downregulate.
It just can't turn off.
Exactly. The brain begins to treat the absence of an immediate threat as a stealthy, invisible threat. Constance finally has to sit him down and administer a harsh reality check.
I bet.
She tells him that disaster will inevitably find them again, simply because they are mortal. But the years between the disasters are not just waiting periods to endure, they are the actual point of living.
So what does this all mean for his overarching philosophy? Can this kind of weaponized, relentless hope actually become dangerous to other people?
That's the real question.
I mean, we have seen it save his life and the lives of those immediately around him, but surely there is a dark side to being so relentlessly certain that everything will always be fine.
If we connect this to the bigger picture of how we interact with society, We have to look at the Duel of 1874. It perfectly illustrates the ethical danger of absolute certainty.
Oh, this story is wild.
It is. Prior to this, Theodore had started writing and selling these little philosophical penny tracts to the public. One of his most popular pamphlets was titled Financial Recovery, a Mathematical Certainty.
Which sounds incredibly comforting to a desperate person until you stop to realize that mathematics operate on an infinite timeline while human lives are very short.
Exactly the problem. A man named Cornelius Blackwood bought this tract during a severe economic depression. Believing the absolute certainty Theodore promised, Blackwood held onto his failing bank way too long.
Oh, no.
Yeah. He lost his business, his wife left him, and his life completely unraveled. Blackwood tracked Theodore down in the street, slapped him across the face with a leather glove, and challenged him to a duel at dawn.
Just a classic 19th century reaction.
Completely. Blackwood was furious, not just that he was ruined, but that he'd been sold a false, arrogant hope.
And Theodore, remarkably, accepts the duel. They meet in a field at dawn, they pace away from each other, they turn, and Theodore looks closely at his opponent. He realizes Blackwood's hand is shaking uncontrollably.
Yeah, the man is terrified.
Blackwood doesn't actually want to commit murder. He is just a broken man who wants his old life back.
And this is where Theodore realizes the difference between internal functional delusion and externalizing that delusion onto others.
Right.
He employs a brilliant, high-stakes tactic he calls strategic vulnerability. When the adjudicator finishes the countdown, Theodore raises his pistol, aims directly at the sky, and intentionally fires his only shot into the air.
Wow.
He makes himself completely defenseless.
He drops his weapon and tells Blackwood, I am unarmed. You can shoot me if it will fix your life. Or you can accept that honor is satisfied.
Such a move.
Right. By dropping his defenses entirely, it forces Blackwood to confront his own humanity instead of fighting a philosophical concept. Blackwood lowers his gun, falls to his knees, and just starts sobbing.
And the historical record shows they actually went to a diner for breakfast that morning and became lifelong friends.
Which is just incredible. But the mechanics of that morning forced a profound shift in Theodore. He realized that hope is a powerful medicine, but it must be offered carefully.
Very carefully.
You cannot prescribe your own internal survival mechanism arrogantly as an absolute guaranteed cure for someone else's complex pain. There's a vast difference between self-delusion for personal survival and selling certainty to a desperate stranger.
That realization seems to pivot his focus for the remaining decades of his life. He stops looking for grand historical disasters to conquer.
He's done with the wars and the fires.
Yeah. He realizes that you don't need a massive earthquake or an armed duel to utilize these psychological tools. The exact same techniques that keep your brain functioning during a shipwreck are entirely applicable to the mundane, grinding micro-disasters of everyday life.
Because nobody throws you a parade for successfully surviving a Tuesday.
No, they don't.
But in many psychological ways, those small, daily survivals are actually harder to endure. They completely lack the dramatic, adrenaline-fueled narrative of escaping a burning building. You don't get a hero's journey, you just get the grind.
In the manual, he details this in a section called the Minor Catastrophe Encyclopedia, and it is almost painfully relatable to read today.
Oh, it really is.
For instance, he highlights the catastrophe of an excruciatingly boring conversation at a dinner party.
We've all been there.
Right. You feel trapped, the person's just talking at you, and social politeness prevents escape. But Theodore applies his granular optimism. It feels like a catastrophe, but it will end.
Eventually.
Eventually, biologically, the person has to take a breath or excuse themselves. He applies it to the catastrophe of waiting in line at the post office, too. It is a terrible experience, but physically, every passing second brings you closer to the front than when you started.
He even documents a grueling 72-hour bout of insomnia he suffered in 1898. He describes lying awake in the dark, slowly descending into that specific madness where you feel like you are the only conscious being left in the universe.
It's the worst.
But his technique holds steady. You must recognize that your biological state will change. You have slept in the past, you will sleep again in the future. Insomnia, by definition, always ends.
Here's where it gets really interesting for anyone trying to apply this today.
Yeah.
Theodore develops a linguistic practice to handle these moments, which he calls the and yet method.
The and yet method.
Yeah, it is the verbal embodiment of his entire philosophy, and it's a brilliant way to ground yourself. You state the terrible thing objectively, you say the words and yet, and you add a true, undeniably less catastrophic fact.
Give me an example.
So, for example, I lost my job. and yet I still possess highly marketable skills. Or, I am going through a terrible breakup, and yet I have a supportive family.
What makes the and yet method so structurally sound is that it acknowledges the harsh reality of the suffering while firmly insisting on continued existence beyond it. It isn't blind denial.
Not at all.
And this distinction is crucial because the sources note that Theodore explicitly abandoned the practice of what we now call forced gratitude.
He actually tried keeping a gratitude journal.
Really?
Yeah. For 30 years, he tried writing down 3 things he was thankful for every single night, and he finally just threw the book in the fire.
He literally threw it in the fire.
Threw it away. Because he realized that on a truly devastating day, forcing yourself to feel actively grateful feels exactly like you are gaslighting your own emotions.
Wow, yeah.
His survival method isn't about ignoring a terrible day or pretending a tragedy is actually a secret blessing in disguise. It is simply about neurologically recognizing that the bad day has an endpoint.
Which is such an immense relief to hear. You don't have to be thankful that your transmission blew out on the highway or that you got passed over for a promotion. You just have to deeply internalize the fact that the bad feeling has an expiration date.
Exactly.
Theodore successfully navigated 97 years of these endpoints. But, as he cheerfully notes in the Manual for the Devil, human survival ultimately has a 0% long-term success rate.
It always catches up to you.
Always. Eventually, every single one of us is going to face the one catastrophe that isn't nearly over.
The final, unavoidable catastrophe.
The date is June 15th, 1924. Theodore is 97 years old. He is attending his granddaughter's beautiful garden wedding on a perfect summer afternoon.
Such a nice setting.
Very nice. He stands up to give a toast to the young couple. He tells the crowd that humanity has finally conquered needless suffering, the wars are over, and the future is endlessly bright. He finishes his speech, sits down, and pops an olive into his mouth.
An olive that was advertised as being pitted.
But it absolutely was not.
No, it wasn't.
The pit lodges in his throat. He starts choking. The wedding guests rush over in a panic, trying to perform early, unpracticed versions of the Heimlich maneuver. Theodore calmly waves them away.
He just waves them away.
Yeah. He dies in about 40 seconds. It is a hilariously tragic, completely mundane, unheroic end for a man who had survived so much violent history.
But the ultimate irony, and perhaps the ultimate validation of his entire life's work, is revealed in his final conscious thought as he choked. He couldn't speak to the panicked guests, but his brain processed one clear, familiar thought.
The worst is nearly over.
The worst is nearly over.
And he was entirely right. Death ended the physical panic. Death ended the choking. The worst was finally completely over.
Which brings us back to the framing device of our source material, the epilogue in Hell's Sub-Basement. Theodore finishes dictating this massive manual. He looks across the table at the devil and asks, "So, was I right about any of it?"
And the devil finally delivers his verdict.
The devil looks at him and says, "You were wrong about almost everything." Right. He says, "The wars lasted years longer than you predicted. The earthquakes and fires were far worse than you admitted. Your timelines were absurd, and your relentless optimism was often completely unfounded in reality."
But the devil concedes the core genius of Theodore Brightness. He admits that Theodore's philosophy was a highly useful truth that simply couldn't be verified until after it became true.
The functional delusion, the hope itself, was the mechanical engine for his survival.
Which brings us to the very end of the manual and a thought I really want to leave you with. Theodore leaves a blank chapter at the end of his dictation titled simply, etc.
Etc.
Yeah. It is an invitation to the reader. And it leaves you with a lingering, provocative question, especially when you think about how we live today. We live in an information age where our phones constantly feed us the catastrophic realities of 8 billion people in real time.
It's overwhelming.
It is. If Theodore's functional delusion was necessary to protect his brain from a single war or a single fire, what happens to us in modern society? Are we actually biologically wired to handle the sheer volume of global tragedy we consume daily?
Probably not.
Or is functional delusion no longer just a quirky historical trick, but an absolute psychological necessity for modern survival? The universe doesn't possess a moral arc, and there is no guaranteed happy ending. But if a functional delusion gives you the psychological strength to carry a stranger's child toward the lake while a city burns to the ground, does it really matter if it's a lie?
That's the real question.
Think about the catastrophes you're currently dealing with right now, the ones you are turning into permanent, unmovable fixtures in your mind. What would change in your body right now, today, if you simply decided the worst was nearly over? Because when the emotional grid overloads, sometimes you have to trip the circuit breaker yourself. Shut down the panic, focus on the very next breath, and you might just find you have the energy to survive the hour.